Hi, I'm Chris Crum, and welcome to Sonoran Desert 101's third video on the human history of the McDowell Mountain region. In our first two history segments, we discussed the archaic hunter-gatherers and the early Native American cultures of the Yavapai, Apache, and Pima, more properly known as the Akimel O'odham. Now we'll explore the early European and military influences on our region. As we all know, in 1492, Christopher Columbus reached the Americas, an event that ended the isolation that then existed between the Old and New Worlds. During the following 50 years, the Europeans, mainly the Spanish, explored and attempted to conquer the southern and central portions of the new continent. By the mid-1500s, the Europeans started to exercise their cultural and military influences on the southwestern portions of North America and on the native peoples of what was to become Arizona. These events represented a major impact on the local environment and in the lives of the tribes living in the McDowell Mountain region. Here's a quick summary of the major incursions and the timeframes in which they occurred. As you see from the slide, the Spanish were followed by the Mexicans and the Americans. The Arizona Territory became part of the United States at the end of the Mexican-American War via the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1948. Southern Arizona became part of U.S. territory through the Gadsden Purchase, which occurred in 1853. Our objective in this segment is to provide you with an overview of these events. So let's begin. The Spaniards arrived in Central America around 1510. They conquered the Mayan Empire in 1519 and established the Kingdom of New Spain in what is today's Mexico. In 1540, the Spanish launched the Coronado expedition in North America. They were searching for the gold and silver that they found in South and Central America. Well, they didn't find it, or the fabled city of gold, but they did discover the Grand Canyon and named its river as the Colorado. The Spanish brought with them their religious, social, and military organizations, and they also brought animals then unknown here, such as horses and cattle, along with a variety of new plant life. Unfortunately, germs and diseases previously unknown in the New World were also introduced, and they took a terrible toll on the indigenous populations. This encounter between the civilizations of the Old and New Worlds produced a transfer of plants and animals, which is known as the Columbian Exchange. Here you see some of the plants and animals that were exchanged between the New and Old Worlds as a result of the opening of the Americas. Europe got turkeys, tobacco, potatoes, peppers, beans, and tomatoes, just to mention a few. The Americas got dairy animals along with sheep, pigs, and horses. New plants included grapes, coffee, peppers, and bananas, among others. Both the Old and New Worlds gained advantages from the exchange, and both environments were changed forever. A few more words about the Coronado expedition before we leave that. Here in red is the presumed route followed by Coronado. We say presumed because most of the original descriptions and maps have been lost, but it is certain that they came through today's Arizona following most likely the San Pedro and Gila rivers. This expedition lasted 2 years, from 1540 to 1542, and it represents the first encounter of the North American natives with the Europeans. During the following 200 years, the Spaniards established a number of missions in the area to convert the Native Americans to Christianity and also to increase their social and economic control. To gain a sense of the Spanish missions, we suggest a day trip to the mission and Presidio of San Javier del Bac, as well as Tubac and Tumacacori, all just south of Tucson here in Arizona. To give you an idea of what it meant to mount an expedition in those days, here's a list of its components. 350 Spaniards, two-thirds of which were mounted on horses, 5 Franciscan friars or clergymen, 1,300 native soldiers from the local tribes, 1,500 horses and mules, large herds of sheep and cattle, and enough servants to attend the herd and keep everything else working. Clearly, this was no small undertaking. Another great transformational impact in North America, including the Southwest, was the animal fur trade that took place between the mid-1700s and mid-1800s. Europeans exchanged goods like firearms, metal cooking pots, knives, and cloth with the Native Americans who, in exchange, provided animal furs. Those would be otters in the Pacific Northwest and beavers in the inland West, which included Arizona. In those days, our clothes were mostly wool and cotton, so animals' fur provided a warm and waterproof alternative. Both Europe and China were customers for that market. Among the first trappers in Arizona was an expedition that arrived in 1829. Following the Salt, Gila, and Verde rivers, and led by Ewing Young, the group included a 16-year-old cook who would go on to make his name in the history of the West. He was Kit Carson. As the U.S. expanded westward in search of land and other riches, the Southwest became an attractive destination. In 1863, gold and silver were discovered in Arizona. Miners arrived, and of course, they needed supplies and food. This created a need for cattle and the development of agriculture. As the cattle roamed and supply trains loaded with goods rumbled through, the Indians came to the conclusion that it's time to hunt and gather. From the U.S. perspective, the Indians were in the way of progress. As a result, the U.S. government deployed its most consistent form of diplomacy to address the issue. Can you guess what that was? Well, if you said the military, you guessed right. Fort McDowell was established here in 1865 and remained in service until 1890 with the end of the Indian Wars in the area. Fort McDowell was one of the 4 major forts in the Arizona Territory in the late 1800s. Each post hosted from 200 to 500 cavalry and infantry troops. Their activities included training exercises, parades, and patrols. They also maintained gardens for fresh food that were irrigated by reestablishing the very same old Hohokam canals. One last note about the military influence in the Western Territories. The only maintained roads in those days were the military roads. One of these in Arizona was called the Stoneman Road, named after the general who commissioned it, George Stoneman. It was built in 1870 and 71 and greatly shortened the trip between Fort Whipple and Prescott and Fort McDowell on the Rio Verde, an important supply connection. Traces of this road are still visible in the preserve. One segment is part of today's trail system near the Browns Ranch site, and the so-called Military Road in Cave Creek also follows the path of the Stoneman Road. This concludes our video segment on the arrival of Europeans and the military in our region. We explored their great influence on the Native American cultures as well as on our environment. I hope you enjoyed it. I invite you to join us for the final chapter of our amazing story. In it, we'll discuss how we, as the current dominant culture, have influenced the region. Can we find a balance between growth and the natural environment? And can preservation be part of our way of living? We'll explore these questions and more in our next segment.